depicting African Americans in an island community. As I'm sure you can tell, these are artists' renditionings, not photographs, for reasons that will become obvious. But in '08, the New Orleans Item printed this article, a long treatise on voodoo, both in Cuba and in Haiti. Uh, the paper claimed that white and black babies both were being sacrificed, quote, to boa constrictors that the voodoo devotees worship as gods in Cuban Haiti. Now, anybody who's ever read a map, even with America's terrible knowledge of geography, will tell you Cuban Haiti is not a place. That is not a thing. I hope somebody tells that to the Navy currently parking in the Caribbean. But despite that, the paper goes on to say that they roast and eat the child, that children are being abducted all over Cuba by voodoos, that voodoo, native to Africa and introduced to Cuba by Negroes brought as slaves and fostered by constant communication with the island of Haiti, was now ubiquitous in Cuba. The paper claims that, quote, the later country, that is Haiti, known as the Black Republic, is absolutely dominated by Negroes and inhabited almost solely by Blacks who live in a state of primitive savagery and ignorance, such as exists hardly anywhere except the African jungles, end quote. The paper claimed that songs were sung in Haiti to Papa Damba, that is uh, uh, bastardization of the name of a Haitian Loa, Dambala. That they sing these songs to Papa Damba to damn whites and mulattoes and help blacks. They, quote, pray to pull to hell the ships of the whites, send us bodies of the whites to burn and show your glory, end quote. The paper claimed that it is said that this call, if sounded by Papa Loa within the hearing of the National Palace, would cause the president, cabinet members, and all to desert affairs of state and go to the priest, end quote. This is part of cultural and uh, literary project being engaged in New Orleans at this period and throughout the US. Again, this happens in 1908. It might not surprise you to know that in 1906, the US invaded Cuba and occupied the island, where they remained until 1909. Using this kind of image of Black and African savagery is a tool to argue that these people are backward and unqualified to govern themselves, which gives an excuse for the US occupation, right? Tie the Cubans to Haiti, tie the Haitians to Africa, and then argue that Africans cannot govern themselves, which justifies the US governing these people for them, right? It might not surprise you to know that just a few years later, in 1915, the US also invaded and occupied Haiti, where they would remain until 1934. It's not a coincidence that this is published in a Louisiana newspaper, right? Louisiana has its own history with voodoo, and very similar accounts will be used to argue during Reconstruction after the end of slavery why Black people in Louisiana should not be governing themselves. Because of this narrative that connects Black people in Louisiana to Black people in the Caribbean, and then Black people in the Caribbean to Africa, it's probably also not a surprise that people who practice voodoo in New Orleans do not want to talk about Africa, especially in the early 20th century. Now there's a different project happening, right? in the late 20th century, post-civil rights, post-Black power, people who practice African diaspora religions all over the New World go through a special effort to reclaim their African heritage. So when you hear people talk about voodoo in Louisiana in the 21st century, people in Cuba who practice abacuá or santeria, or people who practice candomblé in Brazil, they can't wait to tell you about their African roots, right? And they will go out of their way to return to Africa to study with priests in places like Benin to talk about the African nature of their own practice, right? That is not what is going on in early 20th century Louisiana. Because of this demonization of Blackness and Africanness, voodoo practitioners in Louisiana do not trace their roots back to Africa. They trace them back to Marie Laveau. You see? These are, you will forgive me, I'm terrible with the PowerPoint, and I hope not breaking this thing. We'll see. Yeah, that'll do. Yeah, there we go. There are no actual photos of Marie Laveau. This is one of a number of artist renditionings of Laveau that will become important for where this conversation is going, right? The fact that we don't actually know what she looks like. By the early 20th century, both believers in voodoo and tourists travel to New Orleans and to special sites in New Orleans like St. Louis Cemetery to visit Marie Laveau's grave, leaving offerings and to entreat her assistance, frequently crossing the tomb with red brick. Well, there we go. The Archdiocese in New Orleans has gone through a lot of effort to restore the tomb a number of times. They've done some wild things here. For a long time, what you would see looking at the tomb is the crumbling red brick facade. That deterioration is worsened by people who come up to the tomb and cross it and leave things on it. And initially tried a restoration, and they put this weird pink plaster on the thing, and people went nuts. Which is how you get to the white facade here, but this is a restoration. The tomb has been worked over, and still you can see folks are crossing it and leaving offerings, still in the 21st century. All that being said, even locals who had no association with voodoo began to lay claim to association with Marie Laveau because she's so important as a cultural figure in New Orleans. There are other saints and spirits that are important to voodoo practitioners in New Orleans. Wait, there we go. These are depictions of St. Peter. St. Peter is frequently called upon to begin voodoo ceremonies. St. Rita is the woman you see on the left. Rita of Cassia is a 14th century figure, 1300s, who's a Catholic saint in the church proper. Voodoo practitioners will adopt her in the 20th century, especially around causes of feminine empowerment. As a part of Rita's own story in the Catholic Church, her hagiography entails her wanting to be a nun, but being forced, I think at 12, to marry a man against her will. She has children. Eventually, her husband and her children die, and then now that she's an adult, she goes off to become a nun, which is what she wanted to do in the first place. And so, because of that hagiography, that narrative, this voodoo practitioners in the early 20th century began calling upon Saint Rita to help them in abusive relationships, to get rid of men who are harming them. There are great stories there. But none of these figures, right, are quite as important to voodoo practitioners as Marie Laveau. It's important that they invoke them, right? Much like in Haitian voodoo, right? If you ask a Haitian practitioner if they practice voodoo, that's never how they define themselves. If you ask most Haitians what religion they practice, they'll tell you they're Catholic, right? But then if you ask them about other practices, what they will say in addition is, but I also serve the spirits, right? They won't say I practice voodoo because they think of themselves as Catholic. In a similar fashion, in New Orleans in the early 20th century, a lot of these people think of themselves as Christians, as Catholics, as Baptists, but what they do in addition is voodoo, right? And so the invoking of these Catholic images is super important to their practice. Again, maybe not as important as the invocations around Marie Laveau, but important to understand how they think about themselves, right? As opposed to how other people want to define them. The historical record around Marie Laveau is actually pretty thin, right? She begins popping up in newspapers before the Civil War in New Orleans. In July of 1850, Marie Laveau appears in the paper in connection with a judicial complaint that she'd filed against the municipality for confiscating a wooden statue at a June 27th raid of another practitioner's house, a woman named Betsy Toledano. Before the Civil War, it's illegal for free Black people to gather with enslaved Black people to gather with white people. The fear is that these free Black people will corrupt the enslaved and inspire them to revolt, right? So it's enough that free Black people, enslaved Black people, and white people, especially white women, are gathered together in this place. That's enough to arrest them and break this up. In the process, the police take artifacts from the house. And Laveau is bold enough to show up at the police station and say, even though this gathering's illegal, and say, you have my stuff and I want it back. In 1859, almost 10 years later, a case is brought against Marie Laveau that appears in the newspapers in connection with an accusation brought against her by a neighbor for disturbing the peace. Again, in connection with, quote, fighting and obscenity and infernal singing and yelling, quote, out of a building that she owned. These are some of the only documented cases of Marie Laveau appearing in public, and the only real documented indications that she practiced voodoo in New Orleans. That being said, the stories around Marie Laveau's practice are much larger and much more plentiful, right? And by the time you get to the early 20th century, when they interview voodoo practitioners, they invariably talk about their association to Marie Laveau, right? And folks who view themselves as culturally important in New Orleans or want to make themselves seem that way, even if they don't practice voodoo, will lay claim to Marie Laveau. Fair-skinned people will lay claim to Marie Laveau and talk about her heritage and her skin color and her phenotype, right? Brown-skinned people will do the same thing and alter the narrative around her phenotype and her appearance. Most frequently, when Marie Laveau is depicted, this is what she looks like, right? I don't know if you can tell from the painting, but there's a slight curl to her hair. She's wearing this very elaborate scarf that historians refer to as a tignon. That goes all the way back to the Spanish period in New Orleans, when government officials in the city actually mandated legally that women of color had to wear these in public. The idea is that these mixed race women in New Orleans were tantalizing white men and drawing them away from their white wives with their curly hair. And so they needed to cover their hair. They actually legislate around this, right? But that means when Marie Laveau is depicted, painting her in the tignon is a way of signaling her connection to the long cultural history in New Orleans. Witnesses, though, who claim to have known Marie Laveau will again argue constantly about what she looked like. And that argument is a signification of what Blackness meant in New Orleans in the early 20th century, right? Much of this material comes from the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, right? The WPA funds something called the Louisiana Writers Project. They do this in a lot of states, in Florida. I'm most familiar with Louisiana and Florida. Zora Neale Hurston, very famous Black scholar and novelist associated with the Harlem Renaissance, famously works for the Florida Writers Project, right? Here in Louisiana, when they become aware of this history of voodoo, the Louisiana Project begins sending writers out to interview people who are associated with voodoo. And that's how we get some of our firsthand accounts from the mouths of people who actually practiced about what they are doing and what they think they're doing. Prior to this, all of the reports are from newspapers and police who are arresting and prosecuting these people, which makes them questionable, right? As accurate depictions of what voodoo practitioners are doing and what they think, right? All that being said, by the time you get to the WPA in the Depression era in the 1930s and Louisiana Writers Project, they're interviewing people who, again, argue about who Marie Laveau is, who she is to the city, who she is to them, who she is racially. We know from historical records that Marie Laveau is born as a free woman of color. She'd never been enslaved. Both her parents were local to Louisiana and born in the city. Uh, we also know that she identified as Creole. Now, I do this with my students all the time because in South Louisiana, it's getting better. The answers are getting better. But in South Louisiana, there's a lot of confusion about what it means to be Creole. Does anybody know what Creole means? What's your definition of Creole in the back?
Descended from people who were here before the Louisiana Purchase. A
Okay.
very broad and vague way of saying it.
Sure.
The simplest way to put it.
Sure. That's actually pretty accurate, though. That's better than what I usually get. Anybody else? What does it mean to be Creole? I know I've wandered into Cajun country. We're having a different conversation. But what does it mean to be Creole? Anybody? Right, right. It's yes, yes.
Yeah, mostly, I guess it may be that Spanish influence.
Yeah, Creole identity is much more of an urban thing in southern Louisiana. So around places like New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and then in the river parishes in between, you get a lot more conversation about Creole. As you move away from the river, Cajun becomes a much bigger thing out into the bayou and things like that. All that being said, there are all these associations, right? When folks with the word Creole, really the word Creole means American. Latin speaking people, right? People who speak Romance languages, the French, the Portuguese, they use the term Creole to refer to people who live in their colonies. So they're acknowledging when somebody in France calls somebody in New Orleans Creole, they're acknowledging that they're French, but American French. You're from over there, right? And so Creole is really a reference to things that originate in the New World, right? Which is why you can have Creole people and Creole language and also Creole tomatoes, right? Because all these things are from the New World. That being said, it's a strange interaction that happens in New Orleans that is very important for the way people try to identify Marie Laveau. After the Louisiana Purchase, when the Americans start moving in, they use the term Creole to refer to the local French-speaking population, right? But because the Black population in and around New Orleans, which is where most people in Louisiana live, circa 1804, right, around the Purchase, almost everybody in Louisiana is just packed in around the city of New Orleans, right? Uh, because there's a much higher Black population in New Orleans, you had a lot more race mixing. White men are a lot more willing to take on Black and also Native American partners because there aren't a lot of white women in the French colony, right? And so you get a lot more race mixing. And so when the Americans move in and they begin referring to Creoles, they also start to associate it with race mixing because there are so many more. These terms are all rude now. Now we would say biracial, right? Or mixed heritage. Then they said mulatto or quadroon, which is to say one of your grandparents is black, or octoroon, which is to say one of your great grandparents is black, but that still makes you black in 19th century Louisiana. Um, all of that stuff is associated with Creole identity. When people talk about Marie Laveau, all of these things come up, right? When they identify her as Creole, it's carrying all that baggage, right? So when they talk to witnesses in this period, they will identify Marie Laveau by language, by skin color, and by dress, and attempts to establish her cultural orientation, right? Uh, the French-speaking population will persist throughout the 19th century. They begin to die out in this period during the Great Depression, right? Uh, my grandmother was part of the last generation. She was born in the 1920s, part of the last generation to say that they learned French in the home and not at school, right? But after that, it starts to fade dramatically. That being said, uh, American versus Creole identity is super important in the ways people talk about Marie Laveau. Claims that Laveau had lighter skin color than most African Americans and curly hair and wore exotic, brightly colored clothing reflect attempts to invoke perceptions of Creole identity that conflated French language with racial mixing, what they call at the time miscegenation, and voodoo. Refuting images of Marie Laveau as fair-skinned reflected attempts to claim her power and her influence and her status as a cultural icon by African Americans outside the Creole community. For instance, a woman named Gloria Jones, who's interviewed by the WPA in the 1930s, remembered participants in voodoo rituals as being dressed in colorful clothing and, quote, singing in Creole, right? Jones is very careful to say that even though she identified as Creole, she had nothing to do with voodoo. What she said was, me and my family are dignified and we don't have nothing to do with voodoo. But she feels it necessary to then, even though they say they did not entertain talk of voodoo, she interjects to the interviewer deliberately that her grandmother knew Marie Laveau. So I don't have nothing to do with voodoo, but I want my family associated with the most famous voodoo figure in New Orleans, right? Which is to say her cultural impact has spread beyond the community of people who think of themselves as voodoo practitioners. Uh, much as the stigma of race mixing challenged white Creole status as fully white in Louisiana, right? Associations made between Creole identity and voodoo served a similar purpose for the Afro-Creole community. In other words, white Americans, Anglos, English speakers will frequently try to indict white Creoles, white French speakers in the 19th century by arguing that by virtue of being Creole, they're black, right? That there's race mixing in their family that they're not talking about. Similarly, when people want to demonize members of the Afro-Creole community who are often thought of due to their own arrogance and mistakenly as being more sophisticated than Anglo-speaking black people, right? When outsiders want to demonize that community, they accuse them of practicing voodoo, if that makes sense. Uh, in 1940, WPA interviews another informant named Joseph Morris. Morris remembered Marie Laveau from his childhood when he said he was, quote, familiar with her home and knew her well enough to refer to her as grandma. Again, this is somebody being interviewed in 1940. It's probably important to note that Marie Laveau dies in 1881. Joseph Morris described Marie Laveau as portly and brown skinned, which is nothing like this picture, right? Uh, he asserted in no uncertain terms that Marie Laveau was not racially mixed or light skinned, and that pictures like this that suggested that she was were simply faded. He said that Marie Laveau and other dancers performed at Congo Square and did wear, quote, unusual clothes. So Morris has no problem with identifying Marie Laveau as Creole, right? But does not like the idea of her being identified as mulatto or mixed race because that distances her from the majority of the Black community. Another informant named Oscar Felix actually claimed that he himself was a voodoo practitioner. He said that he had participated as a child. Again, this is in the 1930s. She died in 1881. He said that he had participated as a child, as a singer at Marie Laveau's ceremonies, and described Marie Laveau as, quote, a good looking brown skinned woman, tall and like a queen, end quote. So Felix is splitting the difference here, right? He wants to say, yes, she is Black, like we are all Black, right? And there's nothing wrong with voodoo. I practice voodoo. Voodoo's great, right? Uh, but she's not who you think she is if you need her to look like this. He says that she did wear a, quote, handkerchief around her head, which is probably a reference to the Tignon. Said that she was brown skinned and held on to the Creole sartorial markers. Felix openly admitted again to being a voodoo practitioner himself, but remembering his connection as having performed in her ceremonies is an attempt by him as a 20th century practitioner to lay claims to her power as a voodoo practitioner and as the most important root for the tree of voodoo in New Orleans. These accounts again appear as attempts to hold a place for darker skinned African Americans in the cultural legacy of New Orleans, which is so closely associated with Creole identity and race mixing, though those things are not synonymous. I'm sorry, I'm just pressing buttons. Am I doing that? Um, the majority of images remember Laveau again as Creole and fair-skinned and often wearing the tignon, though those things are not synonymous. If we look at this image, this is an artist renditioning of a woman with obvious African features and wearing the tignon, which is to say that you do not have to be fair-skinned or mulatto to be identified as Creole. Uh, but what they are essentially saying when they do this is how quintessentially New Orleanian, how quintessential to how tied into the city's cultural markers that Marie Laveau and they are. Uh, some witnesses claim that Laveau only sang in French or wore the tignon as a colorful, quote, Creole clothing, part of Creole clothing at dances in Congo Square and Bayou St. John. Mary Washington claimed when she was interviewed that Marie Laveau spoke broken English but fluent French. We're pretty sure this is also not true because of some of the records we have of folks who say that they knew her in the late 19th century. But what they're trying to say is Marie Laveau is Creole the way we all are in New Orleans to some extent. Uh, they also argue that her mother was from Saint-Domingue, from Haiti. Again, while there's a historical trend, there's a reason to believe that this is possible. The record suggests that it's not true, that her parents were born in New Orleans. More than half of the Black population in and around New Orleans at the beginning of the 19th century is actually from Haiti. That conversation that they're having in 1908 around the relationship between Haiti and Cuba, when the Haitian Revolution breaks out in the 1790s, a lot of the enslavers, in order to maintain their human property, run from Haiti to Cuba and take their slaves with them. They don't do very well in Cuba, and many of them migrate then from Cuba to New Orleans. And so you have a huge influx of enslaved people at the beginning of the 19th century. So it's not that this is impossible that her parents could have been from Cuba. I mean, excuse me, from Haiti. It's just not true in this particular case. That being said, the New Orleans Item Tribune published a story remembering Marie Laveau that identified her house as the, quote, quadroon quarter. Again, as far as we know, this is not a thing. But what they're trying to say is, oh, she's this person that you think she is in terms of her racial identity. Maybe the most surprising attempt that I found in my research of the WPA interviews to claim Marie Laveau comes from a white man named John Paul Smith, who at the time of the WPA interview is 72 years old. Smith claimed that Marie Laveau held dances exclusively for white people, hosted by octoroon girls, and that, quote, she never fooled with the niggers around here, end quote. So in Jim Crow, Louisiana, even though everybody thinks of Marie Laveau as Black, she's become so culturally important that even white people want to attach themselves to her, while simultaneously trying to distance her from her own Black identity. A man named Leo Bronson, also white, who was an antique dealer in the French Quarter, claimed that his mother-in-law had bought Marie Laveau's old home after her death. Now, Marie Laveau's house was on St. Anne Street on the edge of the French Quarter. This is not the same house. His mother does not own her house. But he said that his mother, after her death, they found in his mother's house a dried, petrified snake skin in the house that belonged to Marie Laveau, taking us full circle back to that original picture of babies eating snakes. There we go. Taking us full circle back to these images of snakes and voodoo and the association between them. A lot of witnesses would claim later, again, with questionable veracity, that Marie Laveau would dance in Congo Square holding a large boa constrictor. Again, the actual documented evidence suggests that Marie Laveau never did this, but never danced in Congo Square, never with a snake. Even in the 19th century, practicing any religion, even into the decades into the American period when Marie Laveau was recorded as doing anything in public, practicing religion, this kind of religious ceremony in a public space like Congo Square would have been anathema. And so, by all accounts, the best historical account suggests that if Marie Laveau practiced, she would have done it in the privacy of her own home. But makes for a good story, makes for an image, right? Quite a picture. The claims of these white men to an association with Marie Laveau demonstrated how widespread the need to identify with her was, despite, again, her Blackness, their whiteness, and the nature of Jim Crow, right? All of this reminds us that claims to what it is to practice this religion in New Orleans, in the Caribbean, throughout the Western Hemisphere, have all of this racial baggage and are frequently part of larger political projects to establish first who Black people are, and then by reference to who Black people are, who Americans are, right? And what their cultural projects are vis-a-vis Black folks throughout the diaspora. But that's all I have for the presentation. I can take questions if you guys have any. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Go back to get her census record.
Yes. Yes.
How would they refer?
So Marie Laveau is identified as Black. Census records at that period usually don't go into these kind of quadroon, octoroon, that kind of thing, right? Right. As far as we know, so the best book length historical treatment of Marie Laveau is a book by a woman named Carolyn Long, right? What she's identified in historical records is that not only is Marie Laveau Black, but her relatives going back at least 2 generations are Black. She's done some great research. There are moments Laveau is a complicated figure, actual historical Laveau, right? Not the mytho-historical Laveau that these people are remembering is very, very complicated. Marie Laveau, there's a good book, it's very, very short, that traces the history of the tomb owned by Marie Laveau. And there's this, the above ground tombs in New Orleans are pretty well known as tourist attractions, right? They do this thing in New Orleans that always horrifies people from outside of New Orleans, called dropping the bones, where you bury the person in the tomb, and then when their body finally deteriorates, so that the family can continue to use the tomb, you drop their bones to the bottom of the tomb, their remains, and then you put somebody new in the box. Historical records suggest that Marie Laveau did this sometimes for poor Black people and allowed them to be buried in her tomb, even though they were not related to her. That suggests a very positive relationship to the Black community, right, at large. We also know that historically, though, through various points in her life, Marie Laveau also owned enslaved people. Now, the ownership of enslaved people by other Black people is very complicated, right? Most Black people who own enslaved people do so on their way to freedom. There are laws that are passed throughout the U.S. South that make it illegal to free Black people except under certain circumstances. And so most Black people who own other Black people own them because they're their relatives, and you buy them in order to free them from an enslaver, but then you can't legally free them yourself. So on paper, you own them, but good chance exerting that force in the household. You bought your wife, good luck, treat her like a slave. Um, but so we don't know if Marie Laveau owning Black people is that kind of ownership or if it's something more exploitative. Because a lot of other Black folks do. The numbers are relatively small in terms of Black folks who like own plantations and buy enslaved people and work them like that. That does happen, especially in and around New Orleans and cities like Charleston, where you have a large free Black population who manages to come into enough wealth to do that. So it does happen. But a lot of Black folks will buy other Black folks for profit in a way that is temporary. We don't know what Marie Laveau's slave ownership looks like on the ground. We just know that she owned them because of the historical record. I don't know if that answered your question. I feel like I started rambling.
Do you know who her family members were?
So we know about her. We know about. Oh, I'm not sure, but I haven't seen any of that research. A lot of the historical research, the best historical research that's been done about Marie Laveau was before people started spitting in a cup to have their DNA traced, right? So I'm not sure about that. What we know about is historically her parents who came before her and her daughter who outlives her. But I'm not sure about wider connections than that. Yeah. Yes, but the daughter, that's a very complicated. Uh, the daughter goes out of her way to distance Marie Laveau from any practice of voodoo and to identify her very strongly with the Catholic Church. And so we're not sure about what happens after that. There are a lot of stories, a lot of myths that her daughter's children move away from Louisiana and pass as white. But those are stories too. We're not sure. The history of that is very shaky. Yeah. If they right in the lieu of the what the folks at what's the Jefferson Museum have done, the Thomas Jefferson Museum. Yeah, what's that plantation called? Monticello. Yeah. Because now they'll talk about Sally Hemings and her people, and people have been able to use the DNA trace to connect themselves to Hemings and to Jefferson.
What's the
Yes, sir.
significance of the X's on to the people marking the X's? What's the significance of that?
So it's always three. It's always three X's, and the idea is that you have to X the tomb 3 times, and sometimes there's a ritual, a dance slash spinning ritual that people do after they mark the thing 3 times. You have to spin 3 times in order to invoke Marie Laveau's spirit. Why it's X's and not crosses, given the Catholic space, is not clear. Though in Haitian voodoo, there's this notion of the crossroads that's super important between where the world of the spirit meets the world of the living. It may have something to do with that. It's not clear because people in New Orleans are so loath in the early 20th century to connect themselves to anything in Haiti. That's not clear. Though there are a lot of Haitian cemeteries that also look like this, that have the above ground tombs. And they perform a lot of crossroads rituals. There's a very famous in Port-au-Prince. There's a very famous cemetery where voodoo practitioners go historically, and a very large Catholic cross that they view as a symbol of the crossroads, where they go to perform rituals. So it may have something to do with that, but that's a lot of guesswork, because the people who are practicing in the early 20th century in New Orleans will never connect themselves to anything in Haiti. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Have you found evidence of voodoo practiced in other parts of Louisiana?
So yes, there's some good research. There's a very strange guy who's it's a Protestant minister who engages in a very long-term project to interview religious practitioners of what he thinks of as alternative religions throughout the U.S. South, from like Memphis, Tennessee, all the way down to Louisiana. He interviews folks outside of the city, who identify as voodoo practitioners. He identifies folks as far away as Tennessee, who identify as practitioners of what they call hoodoo or voodoo, or those. There's a lot of argument about those terms and what they mean. When you ask practitioners in New Orleans in the early 20th century, they tend to say, "Oh, it's all the same thing," right? But other folks will go out of their way to differentiate. Zora Neale Hurston writes a long paper where she claims to have moved to New Orleans and been initiated in voodoo circles by 3 different practitioners. She claims that hoodoo and voodoo are very separate things. So it depends on who you talk to.
What about
Yes.
the traitors, like the Catholic traitors? Are they tied to voodoo? Are they trying to not be part of the voodoo connection by the traitors as part of being Catholic?
I'm not familiar with the traitors.
Yeah, your grandmother was a traiteuse, a French speaking.
But she would not consider herself part, she would consider herself solely from the Catholic
Right.
African tradition.
Right.
She would not have considered herself. In my remembrance of her, and I knew her for many years,
Uh-huh.
she would not consider herself voodoo.
Okay.
Voodoo.
Right,
She
right.
would consider herself a traiteur. En
Uh-huh.
français, c'est le traiteur.
Uh-huh. The
That's the Cajun thing tied to the Catholic Church.
But she wasn't Cajun.
It's not.
She wasn't Cajun.
It was Creole.
She was Creole.
Real.
So most to the point about the witnesses, most good Catholics don't have anything to do with voodoo, right? They think of it as anathema. That's a little but trying to separate those things is problematic, right? African diaspora traditions in the Catholic world frequently work to tie themselves to the church, whether or not the church likes that. In order to practice, in Cuba, in order to be initiated in a Santeria house or an Abacoa house, first you have to prove that you were baptized as a Catholic. The Haitians, in order to participate in certain rituals, will tie those rituals to Catholic feast days, go out all night and practice in a voodoo temple, and then march together to church, all without going to sleep the next morning on the feast day. So the Catholic Church is not happy about this, but voodoo practitioners don't much care about that. They decide how they're going to be Catholic. Yes.
I taught in Africa, in Cameroon for a number of years in a very Catholic section of the country. And so actually they would consider themselves Catholic, go to mass and that sort of thing, but they blended their traditional religious beliefs with their Catholic beliefs.
And it's only when you're Black that becomes a problem, right? Folk Catholicism is a thing all throughout the Catholic world, right? And you have saints who are canonized because of their association with folk Catholicism in places like Iberia, right, in Spain. And that's largely unproblematic. But when Black folks start doing this with African religion, the church is less sanguine about that. Though Marie Laveau historically supposedly had a very strong relationship with Father Antoine Sadella, who was the pastor at St. Louis Cathedral, was the most important church in New Orleans in the 19th century. So who's drawing the lines and how comfortable they are depends on who you ask. Yeah. Yes.
Of drawing the lines, they are very, very fluid.
Mm-hmm.
Protestants, hardcore Baptists also practiced
Mm-hmm.
voodoo.
Mm-hmm.
And this was into the 20th century
Right.
in Louisiana.
Right.
Depends on how remote you are and how you want to identify at any given time in your life.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of like, which pronoun you choose.
Mm-hmm. Well, and again, part of the virtue of practicing a religion like voodoo is that it gives the practitioners a lot more control over their destiny, right? Right,
That as to go along with your
Right.
or whatever else you're doing.
right.
Your Protestant Bible in one hand,
Mm.
but you have that other little thing that's
Mhm. Right.
protected in another way.
And especially in the Catholic Church where there's so much hierarchy, right? And you don't feel like you control your destiny. Practicing something outside of that frequently gives you a little more control. And that's not limited to Black folks, right? Black folks get dinged for it more often, but a lot of the records that I find of voodoo practitioners in the late 19th and early 20th century are because there's an interaction that is very troubling to authorities between Black free women, Black enslaved women, and white women. That makes white authorities very uncomfortable that there are white women operating in these spaces. So the police are frequently arresting the Black people at these gatherings. Now, because it's the American period, during the French period, this is unproblematic because the Code Noir says you can't be anything but Catholic. So if you're caught doing something that's not Catholic religion, we can arrest you and that's unproblematic. There's no notion of freedom of religion. The Americans are much less comfortable with explicitly arresting you for your religious traditions. And so they arrest you for racial causes. Again, Black people, free people, white people, not supposed to be occupying the same space. And so they arrest you for that, even though what's going on is a religious ceremony. And when the papers write it up, they make it very clear what the most disturbing part of this is, that these women are all together practicing this religion that they find problematic.
It's a feminism thing.
Depending on who you ask. Though voodoo in the early 20th century is unbelievably complicated. It does provide a space for women to build a community and function as leaders in a way they frequently cannot in an institution like the Catholic Church, right? And so it's frequently for that reason read as a very feminist project, right? But if you look at the records of who's practicing in the early 20th century, you find all of these. First, it's not just Black folks. People identify with Black folks, but then you have these white women coming in. Then you find white men who are participating in some fashion, and then Black men too. And so while it's generally thought of as very feminist and very matriarchal, it's very complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on.
But a voodoo priestess,
Mhm. But there are also male priests in voodoo.
but the voodoo priestess, however, has a different position
Yes.
in all of that than even
Yes.
the voodoo
Yes.
male
Yeah.
priest.
And a lot of that stuff is very gendered. The diaspora religions allow for participation and power and influence by a lot of people that don't get it in traditional Christian circles. The women, queer people, um, occupy a very special space in voodoo circles because they're thought of as being in touch with certain loa that are less accessible to heteronormative people. And so the access to power and influence in these traditions for different kinds of people who can't get them in other places is very important. It's just not exclusive. Everybody wants in when it benefits them. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So picture with the boa constrictor,
Mhm.
squeezing the baby.
Hmm.
During that period of time, like I guess this paper is trying to like demonize and make Africans, African Americans seem very primitive and
Mhm.
view as a primitive thing.
Mhm.
But when does the shift of New Orleans capitalizing on voodoo start happening?
Yeah. So I can't give you a date because it's very squidgy. But when people are who's saying what when, and the narrative around that, right? We talked about the WPA papers. I thought it was amazing. You guys have new copies of Gumbo Yaya. I've never seen a copy of that book that wasn't old and in the library. So that's awesome that they're printing that now. But there are a lot of stories. A lot of that stuff's built around the WPA narratives, and when they're taking those stories, and organizations like the WPA are very deliberately in the 1930s and 1940s, including narratives about stuff like voodoo in those kinds of collections, right? Which suggests that there's a shift, that they think that this is not just something to be demonized, that it's part of a unique culture in Louisiana that needs to be preserved, right? And that's happening as early as the 1930s. Now, that doesn't stop people from demonizing voodoo in that point, so it hasn't completely shifted. Even now, a lot of people, again, who identify as Christians and Catholics aren't comfortable with it. But post Black Power, after people become much more comfortable with Black identity in general, you get this shift in religious communities in the Western Hemisphere, in places like Cuba and Haiti, where they use Catholicism to obscure their practice of African diaspora religions. They begin to deliberately lean into the African cultural heritage and re-Africanize those traditions by melding them with related traditions out of places like Benin. So what it looks like at any given period is sketchy. But by the mid 20th century, there's some shift happening, if that makes sense, if that answers your question.
The early Cajun, Canadian,
Okay.
were made to understand you could not call our friends Cajun.
Okay. Okay.
So, it,
Mhm.
it's something, it seems as if there are forces that have marketed, who have used these terms to
Mhm.
make money
Mhm.
and to increase tourism.
Right. The tourism industry in South Louisiana is very dependent on marketing Louisiana as distinct from the rest of the US, right? And stuff like voodoo and right, it serves that purpose, right?
Therefore,
As long as it's making somebody money, probably not. Probably not. I think though, I got the sign flashed at me. I think we're out of time. But thank you guys for listening. And I'll be around, I'll hang around if you have any other questions, signing books and stuff like that.
All right, so